Last time we considered this course on research methodology in terms of what it implies, what it is that leads up to it, and what it is that we are supposed to do as far as the course is concerned. Today we will further look at these introductory aspects of research methodology and go into a little bit of history and see what it is that research methodology implies for our world and why it is important for us. To begin with, it is important to realize that we live in a world which is quite different in nature from what is known as the pre-modern world. There is a certain assumption of a kind of uniformity to our world. It's a ubiquitous world, what we call the modern world. Wherever we are in the world, there may be different kinds of assumptions, different kinds of beliefs, of behaviors, but underlying all this, there is a certain kind of common expectation that may or may not be met equally everywhere, but which nevertheless makes up a certain uniform layer of our world. And this is what we call modern civilization. So, this modernity, it is also believed or assumed, is something that is uh, gradually or rapidly spreading across every particular nook and cranny of the world, turning human beings everywhere into what we call modern subjects. So, what is the nature of modernity and how is it related to what we are studying? What we are studying is very deeply implicated in modernity. Modernity is at one particular level made up of a certain way of thinking and a certain method to acquire and disseminate knowledge. In other words, modernity is characterized by one of its central pillars by epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Now, if we go back in time and try to uh, conceptualize for ourselves how the fabric of the world changed into what we know today and what we assume as the world, as the modern world, we'll find that this takes place really in Europe, and it's something that happens gradually over time, and it is backgrounded by two major revolutions in what is called intellectual history, cultural and intellectual history. The first of these is the European Renaissance. And the European Renaissance is something that occurs around, say, with its beginnings in the 15th century and it goes through the 16th century. And what happens at this time is that a certain central tenets through which the world is understood are shaken and changed. Primarily, I would point to the fact that it is the loss of centrality of the European or Catholic Church. So, the Church of Rome loses its power mainly to secular authorities in the various principalities of Europe. You find that there is other kinds of authorities that challenge the church, and hence what we call know as sacred power gets shaken. This is, of course, accompanied by a tremendous wave of cultural expression, and we are not going to go into that particularly, but look more at the epistemological um, implications of this change. Well, the main epistemological implication is that up until this point, it is the churches that controlled knowledge. Knowledge was essentially something which was handed down by clerics and popes and bishops, and the reason for this is that knowledge was divinely ordained. Um, Literate people did not exist outside of the church. It's mostly reading and writing was a prerogative of churchmen. And once we find that this kind of authority, transcendental authority from above, controlled by an ecclesiastical order, is questioned or becomes less powerful, we find the need for other sources of power in knowledge. So, where are we going to acquire our knowledge becomes a question. Now, we find that this revolution that we know as the Renaissance is quickly followed by a revolution in philosophy that relates to epistemology, and this is known as the Enlightenment. The European Enlightenment is a cascade of thinkers that come at this whole idea about what is knowledge and how can we acquire it, that starts around the 17th century and goes through the 18th century. So if we are to kind of, it's not really a conspiracy, but it's more or less like a set of thoughts or ideas that build on one another. It's like a conversation that ends up with a certain total change that really, in a sense, changes the fabric of the world and how we perceive things and how we proceed towards a certain common goal that we can identify as that of the modern world. So, what are these changes in epistemological or knowledge-based understanding that start from the Renaissance and complete themselves in the Enlightenment? I would first, taking a kind of a holistic view, like to state these as a change of faith primarily. The change of faith is not, it's not really a loss of faith. People often think of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment as the age of doubt and the loss of faith. But it is not really the loss of faith. Throughout the Enlightenment, throughout the Renaissance, there is a strong streak of faith in God that in fact continues. Only the sources are different, and at the same time there is a strong streak of doubt, atheism, and agnosticism that enters, that creates the possibility of another understanding of the universe. But the Enlightenment itself is not based on a loss of faith. It's really based on a change of faith. This change of faith is that of a change from knowledge given down on high through transcendental sources and mysterious lines of hierarchy from the church to common people, to another kind of source of knowledge, which is rationality. In other words, we are now seeing a certain understanding where people are positing the fact that the universe has a certain kind of intelligible content to it. Intelligible content that can be understood implies, in a sense, the hand of God. It's one of the images of the universe that arises during this period is that of the clockmaker divine, that the whole universe is in fact very, very finely tuned machinery that can be understood if only we knew all the laws that make up all the various parts and their interactions with each other. So this kind of a movement of knowledge where we begin to think that in fact it is God's knowledge, God's holistic rationality that has embodied itself or made itself sensible as this universe, is at the foundation of Enlightenment thought. I can actually codify or axiomize the basic ideas of the Enlightenment in this way. The first basic idea would be that the universe is rational. Now, this idea is not new to the Enlightenment. It has its roots in early Greek thought, or at least in what is known as post-Socratic Greek thought, and we'll touch on that a little bit when I go through the history of modern epistemology and its roots. But basically, what we find is that the universe is rational because God is primarily the Word, the intelligence. The intelligence of reality is the divine. And so it isn't that the divine has a property called intelligence and even transcends it, but it is the divine as intelligence that has become this world. Modern philosophers have used the term logocentrism for this kind of thinking. In other words, that the logos, the divine knowledge content, has become this world. Now, the second of these axioms of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, can be thought of as the transcendence of rationality as a faculty. Now, in other words, it's wonderful enough that the world is made up of laws, reasons, and has this kind of intelligible content to it, but it is even more wonderful that we human beings are in a position to understand the fact that the world is intelligible. And that is because we have the faculty with which this intelligible world has been created. In other words, intelligence. Human beings are intelligent, and they possess the faculty of intelligence. Now, this is one of the major sort of tenets of the Renaissance, what is known as man, the measure of all things, that gives a tremendous enthusiasm to that age. This is what really is the revolution in thought, intellectual revolution, that causes a tremendous upsurge of various kinds of creative activities that celebrate the divinity of man, as it were, man the measure of all things. We find these ideas everywhere in the Renaissance. So the reason man is the measure of all things is that man possesses that divine faculty, reason, with which all things are endowed. And so the notion is that there is something in the human being which is transcendent. It is not only transcendent of the world, it is transcendent of the rest of the human being himself. And so this transcendent faculty is no longer a transcendence outside of the human, a divine transcendence which enters through secret channels, through popes and clerics, but a transcendence that is available to every human being in the form of rationality. Rationality can extricate itself from the world and look upon it as if it was an object. So that becomes a corollary of the transcendence of rationality as a human faculty. In other words, the objectifiability of the world and of the self as various objects of inquiry. We can develop an objective perspective on the world and even on ourselves from the viewpoint of our functioning. How do we function? Is this really true? Again, this is a question that's going to be debated. I'm just stating at this point what are the predominating axioms of the Enlightenment. The third such axiom can be stated as the unity of knowledge. In other words, that already in the clockmaker universe idea, we can see the presence of this notion of the unity of knowledge. In other words, the entire cosmos and all the beings in it are in fact meshed together inextricably in one particular mechanism that can be understood, and that ultimately is simple. The simplicity of knowledge, that it looks extremely complex, but if we break it down and if we actually build on all these various understandings of how things are constituted, we'll be able to add them up and come to a coherent vision of the universe. This is the notion of the simplicity of the universe. Now, the fourth axiom that you might say exists over here is that though human beings are rational, though they possess the divine faculty of intelligence which can understand and measure the intelligence of the universe, and therefore in a way add up all that intelligence to make up the total understanding of the universe, arrive at the logos. Therefore, that becomes the telos, or the goal of human endeavor. This is the fourth axiom. The fourth axiom is to arrive at that total knowledge is the enlightenment. True enlightenment is ultimately achievable as the arrival of totality of knowledge through the discovery of all the laws that make up all the various parts of this intelligible universe. Now, it is also understood that however it is that the laws of the universe are constituted in the mind of God, as far as human beings are concerned, we are mortals and we are finite, and hence we arrive at this knowledge in a piecemeal fashion. We arrive at it by adding knowledge to knowledge and making it into a single whole. So this becomes the next axiom, or the final axiom of the Enlightenment, which really is something that connects us to the entirety of the modern age and gives us the sense of why this is an age that has a character or quality different from the pre-modern world. That is, that we immediately become co-opted as modern subjects into this enterprise of building the totality of knowledge which will explain things to the world and explain things to us as human beings, will make the world intelligible to us in its totality. And this is achieved through the setting up of certain methods, systems, conventions, by which the kind of knowledge that we produce in that particular enterprise is something that can build on other knowledge that has gone before and be and be archived as knowledge which will lead to knowledge which will come in the future. So that kind of notion of being a worker in a certain enterprise that belongs to time, the modern age, that eventually ends up giving us systematic knowledge that reveals the total intelligibility of the universe, of the cosmos, has at its bottom the foundational properties of repeatability and verifiability. In other words, whatever knowledge is produced can be repeated by others. It is therefore universal, and it is verifiable, also therefore universal. In other words, it can be repeated through whatever means had been used to arrive at it, and it can be verified by other means as well. Whatever means you use, you can verify the knowledge that has been established. Now, these kinds of tenets that belong to the very principal epistemological foundations of the modern world really spawn what we know as the knowledge academy. The modern knowledge academy is based on these ideas, and the modern knowledge academy is therefore not something isolated to a certain culture, a certain country, or a certain kind of way of seeing things, but is universal. This kind of method, these kind of assumptions, this kind of work, this kind of goal, this arrival at a certain type of knowledge that has certain properties is something universal to our world. Now, this is something really worth pondering, because that is what we are entering into when we say that we are going to do research methodology. Research methodology is a way of methodology by which we will arrive at knowledge which will then become part of the archive of modern knowledge, through which people are gaining constantly even more knowledge. It will become universal knowledge. Now, to think of this a little more, we can go back to one of the things that we touched on in the first lecture. That is, what are the foundations of the varieties of ways in which we acquire knowledge in our world? What are our epistemological foundations? Well, if we think about it, we'll realize that a number of what one might call amateur forms of arriving at knowledge. One of them is hearsay. We are swimming in an ocean of opinions, ideas, experiences, and knowledge. So people tell us certain things that they know, they feel, etc., and we acquire them. There is the saying that one may acquire knowledge either through listening to others or through the school of hard knocks. In other words, through much difficultly acquired personal experience. So we often keep our ears wide open to listen to the experiences of others, and we believe a lot of them based on a variety of reasons, sometimes based on just affinity, based on irrational likes and dislikes, based on a sense of somebody's authority, etc. Sometimes based simply on the fact that it's in writing, that it's been printed, it's on paper, you see. So that these kinds of hearsay forms of information, one kind of acquisition of knowledge that we are involved in our everyday lives. Another is, as I said already, authoritative knowledge. Authoritative knowledge is the kind of knowledge that we take for granted because it emanates from people who we hold to have authority. Now, to what extent do they have authority? Have we tested it, validated it? Have others validated it? Are not questioned. The whole nature of pre-modern knowledge was based on authoritative knowledge, because that's where we were told that what the church tells you is true. So, but we continue to have various forms of authoritative knowledge that each individual believes in in their own lives, because that is part of the subconscious way by which we acquire knowledge at any time. A third kind of knowledge is what is called commonsensical knowledge. Commonsensical knowledge is a kind of easy empiricism. In other words, our senses give us certain kinds of evidences, and our neighbors validate those evidences, and therefore we come to certain kinds of conclusions. Those conclusions we take to be self-evident because we feel that this is known to everybody. But these kinds of commonsensical knowledge give us what are called heuristics. Heuristics are rules of thumb of behavior that we are picking up all the time. This is part of our everyday behavior and everyday understanding of our world for survival and for doing better in it. And so that is a certain kind of knowledge that we are acquiring all the time. Another kind of knowledge is what one might call superstitious knowledge. Superstitious knowledge is again given to us, handed down by various kinds of authorities, by various kinds of irrational understandings that we may arrive at, even perceptions that may have a certain depth of non-rational experience to them. So we take it for granted because there are forms of coherence to the universe that are not necessarily understandable. Okay. Then there is what one might call scholarly knowledge. Now, scholarly knowledge is knowledge that of the kind, the term scholarly today in the modern world has come to mean what I just referred to: knowledge that belongs to the academy, knowledge that is verifiable and testable, that is authentic and not inauthentic in that sense, that is stated using a certain kind of language that we'll get to in a moment, and that has certain types of properties. Now, this kind of scholarly knowledge is what forms the backbone of the modern enterprise of knowledge production. And that is indeed the kind of knowledge that we are going to enter into when we study research methodology. So, regarding scholarly knowledge, one thing that we need to understand regarding how powerful scholarly knowledge has become in our modern world, how much it really dominates the nature of the modern world and how much we rely on it, how magical in a certain sense it is, because it is available to all human beings as evident in a way in which neither authoritative knowledge nor intuitive knowledge nor other forms of knowledge, commonsensical knowledge, nor hearsay knowledge can be seen, particularly in our times, if we look at Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a very interesting example of collective scholarship. Wikipedia is collectively written by scholars, and if somebody writes some kind of hearsay or intuition or something that cannot be validated, you'll find that other scholars in the same field who are actually making inquiries into the same kind of area will pounce on it and will question it for its validity. Where did you get this piece of information? Is it repeatable? Can we also verify it? So this is how Wikipedia is a good evidence of a collective enterprise. The fact that modernity has spawned this collective enterprise that has become synergistic to this amount of holism we are arriving, which surely is the sign of a certain kind of collective intelligence that is working because a certain universal method has been understood and accepted. See? So this is a very good example of the nature of scholarly knowledge in the modern world. Now, to say this is not to downplay the other forms of knowledge that I said, which we must and continue to use. And also there are forms of knowledge there, as I mentioned, intuitive knowledge, knowledge based on non-rational experience, which today have great value and which we need to affirm in ways that the scientific method, the research methodology has not been able to incorporate. But we need to see how we can validate it and how we can insert it into this growing body of knowledge that we assume is the knowledge of research methodology. Later, we might have occasion to think about the notion of a subjective science. What is a subjective science? A subjective science can also lend itself to rigor, the same kind of rigor that the objective science of research methodology does. Also, we'll see how the kind of axioms of the Enlightenment epistemology that I laid out right in the beginning evolve through time. That instead of assuming a clockwork world, instead of assuming the logos as the basis of this world, or instead of assuming possible transcendence of the rationality of human rationality, its ability to objectify the world, these so-called axioms are not really axioms. They're not as self-evident as they seem, and they can and have all been questioned. And so we arrive at a time in which we have modified or nuanced all these understandings in modern research. And there are debates regarding this kind of philosophy of epistemology that continue in our times. But at this point, I'd like to pause and talk about a little bit about the history that leads us to this point, the history of the epistemology of scientific knowledge, and particularly of research methodology, as we will look upon it in this course, that has to do with social science, with the social sciences. So firstly, the question really to ask is, how did we get here, and what is the basis of our research? Okay. First, it's important to realize that terms like science, scientist, and the scientific method are really modern terms. Some notion of science, of course, existed from the very beginning, because science, as a Greek-derived term, just typically means knowledge. And we know that one of the properties of God is omniscience, that is, knows all things. So now the thing is that that kind of use was already there, of course, but the use of science as a discipline, as an academic discipline, with the scientist as the kind of worker in the fields of that discipline, the scientific method as the characterizing method of work, is something that arises only in the 19th century. It's worth pondering that it's in fact so new. So what are the bases of this kind of thinking? The bases go back to the 3rd century before Christ, to rationalism, which arises around that time from a certain lineage of Greek thinkers that today we know as Socratic thinkers. Begins these kind of ways of the whole idea of rationalism begins with people like Socrates and Plato, but it really becomes fully expressed with Plato's disciple Aristotle. So, Aristotle wrote a book called Metaphysics, and in this book he posits the separation of 3 branches of philosophy, that is theology, ontology, and universal science. Theology, of course, is the science of God. None of this, there is any assumption that God does not exist. This is all, in a sense, a different ways of arriving at or inquiring after the nature of a divine reality. And so theology is what one might call a science of religion. Ontology is the science of being, or the philosophy of being. How do we exist? What is the nature of our existence? And what is the nature of existence? Existence and existence. What is the relationship between these? So that becomes ontology. And universal science becomes a certain kind of a way by which we can arrive at the knowledge of how things work. In other words, the basis of natural epistemology through a deduction from first principles. Now, this deduction, the use of rationality to deduce things, to to use logic to arrive, deductive logic, to arrive at conclusions, is, however, not based on sense data, which it is in our world today, but based on axiomatic first principles. So there are axioms of logic and there are axioms of causation. There is the notion of the prime mover or the fixed mover, who is God himself. And out of these basic assumptions, we arrive at a knowledge of the universe which is metaphysical. So this metaphysical understanding is our universal science, and we don't need to necessarily even validate it with our sense data, but the assumption is that sense data will arrive at it, but it's mind or rationality that will give us this understanding. Now, that becomes the source of philosophical knowledge that stays valid, and gradually, as I said, after this, it's really theology that becomes the most predominant field of knowledge, and that is practiced or carried out by the church. But it's only during the 16th century that we find that, in the turn of the 16th and 17th century, that we find one of the earliest challengers of this notion, and that is the thinker Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, who lived from 1561 to 1626, is considered the father of empiricism. Empiricism means that instead of just taking these first principles for granted and making them into the basis of our deductions, we should use our senses to arrive at our knowledge of the world. So our senses are observation and measurements and experiments are going to become the basis of arriving at certain understandings of the world. Now, naturally, there was a clash of empiricism and rationalism that immediately arose. And the age of the Enlightenment, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, are full of this debate of what is proper, what is correct. Should we move from first principles by deduction to knowledge? Is knowledge sort of top down, or is knowledge bottom up, or should we move from the experiments, observations, and various kinds of measurements to arrive at knowledge? So you had philosophers who took one or the other side of this debate. Descartes, for example, very famous for his statement cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, one of the great Enlightenment philosophers responsible for what is known as the body-mind divide, actually sided with the rationalists. On the other hand, the British philosophers Locke and Hume sided with the empiricists. So we find that this kind of debate continues till the next really important step in arriving at modern research methodology, with the birth of what we know as modern physics or modern science, with Galileo and Newton. Galileo and Newton sort of almost form a continuity between themselves, ranging from the mid-16th century to the mid-18th century. Galileo's dates are 1564 to 1642, and the very year that Galileo dies, Newton is born, 1642 to 1727. They're responsible for founding the field of what is known as natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is, again, something that is now going to split itself off from metaphysics, and it's interested in understanding nature and the physical universe. So we find that both Galileo and Newton are giving a lot of importance to empiricism, but at the same time they are invested with the Enlightenment idea of logocentrism. In other words, it's the intelligence or rationality of God that has become this universe. And so, what we find with our senses ought to be validated through these principles of mathematics. In other words, there are perfect laws that can be beautifully encapsulated by mathematics. And another reason for mathematics and its primacy in explaining sense data is that people like Galileo and Newton also believed in the simplicity and the beauty of this world. And so there is a certain kind of aesthetic judgment also being implied here, that if it is mathematical, then it means that it is harmonious. There is a certain kind of rational beauty to it. And also that it is simple in the sense that it's explainable. Complex phenomena are explainable in simple single formulae. Okay, so this is the reason why natural philosophy split itself off from metaphysics and utilized both empiricism and mathematics to arrive at its understandings of reality. The continuation of this kind of thinking, the foundations of classical physics, can even be found in one of the great modern masters of physics, who we think of as breaking with classical physics. In other words, Einstein. When Einstein challenged the whole enterprise of quantum physics by saying God does not play dice, he was in fact going back to thinkers like Galileo and Newton, and to the notion that we live in a perfectly ordered universe. We just haven't come to understand it well enough, and that everything is causatively related and can be mathematically understood and explained. Now, this kind of understanding of a perfect clockwork universe got challenged in the 18th century by Immanuel Kant. And we find that Kant really sows the seeds for a new kind of understanding of the universe, which breaks with logocentrism. Now, Kant did not believe that the universe does not exist, or that it isn't harmonious, or that God does not exist, or that God's intelligence does not imbue the universe. But the basic fundamental seed of doubt that Kant planted in his Critique of Pure Reason is that he questioned whether human intelligence was something that measured up to the understanding of the universe, because after all, it was human intelligence. Now, we can pat ourselves on the back and say that we have an intelligence through which we can explain the universe, but all that we may be doing is finding a way to explain the universe to ourselves. In other words, this is a human explanation of something which exceeds human understanding. So we can find an explanation for things, and we can utilize those explanations to even better our world, but the world as it is still remains unknown and in fact unknowable. According to Kant, the world, though it had a reality, was ultimately unknowable by us. All we arrived at are models and interpretations of the world. So, in other words, our explanations were always going to be subjective. But Kant didn't worry about that too much. He said that we have to acknowledge that and make the best of it. In other words, what are the conditions under which we can arrive at universal knowledge for ourselves? These are the conditions of correct thinking, and these are conditions of unbiased experience. So if the experience is unbiased and if the thinking is logical, we'll arrive at the best kind of explanation possible to human beings. So this is what he was trying to explain. But this kind of doubt on the intelligibility of the universe and our ability to understand it opened up whole new branches of philosophy, which actually bring us into the modern world. This kind of thinking is called critical transcendentalism, and the philosophies that accompanied it in Germany of the time that had their relations and roots in Kantian thought have been called German idealism. Several of the thinkers that followed Kant have been called the German transcendentalists, and so critical transcendentalism of Immanuel Kant led to German transcendentalism. It led later to phenomenology by the thinker Edmund Husserl, and it led to hermeneutics, which was by thinkers such as Husserl's student Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, and it led to critical theory, which also was born in Germany in what is known as the Frankfurt School. All these schools give importance to interpretation. In other words, they heed Kant's basic foundational thinking that human beings don't know the world as it is, but interpret their world. We are all involved in interpreting our experience and expressing it to each other. So, what is the nature of interpretation? That becomes more important than arriving at true knowledge. Now, the next step, major step in what we are talking about regarding the arrival of modern knowledge, of what we are studying as research methods, comes with Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte, who is a German thinker also, belongs to the turn of the 18th and 19th century. So we are now moving into the 19th century, what one might call a post-Enlightenment era. And Comte is very famous for the methodological he gave us the methodological idea of positivism. So Kant contributed the notion of positivism, which again blends rationalism and empiricism, and it talks about the creation of theories by reasoning, verification by observation. So this is theory by reasoning and verification by observation creates a certain kind of a circular dependence, which is central to the scientific method as we know it today. One of the problems, of course, of Comte's positivism is that he still believed in objectification, though by now the whole notion of knowledge being subjective had already infected the philosophy of science, or the philosophy of what is called natural philosophy at that time. Still, the notion was that objects of inquiry can be objectified, that we can look at things as it were, as if they were separate from us. Our dependence or participation in things could be minimized, both through our rationality and through our experiments, and that we could actually use our observation and our thinking to arrive at scientific knowledge. So this circular dependence works like this in the case of Auguste Comte, that we arrive at certain theories by our reason. In other words, we look at the world, we begin by empirical methods to study the world, and by studying the world we arrive at certain theories, and then we go back to the world and find out more sense evidence that either validates that theory or invalidates it. So this is the verification phase. The first, when we arrive at a certain kind of an idea of what the theory is, that is called the hypothesis stage. So the scientific method, as Comte developed it in terms of positivism, rests on forming a hypothesis, which is a tentative theory, testing the hypothesis, forming the hypothesis through sense evidence, and then testing the hypothesis through further test evidence, and then using again one's logic to deduce from the data that one has arrived at through sense evidence whether that hypothesis is validated or invalidated, in other words, verifying it. This method, particularly the necessity of verification, created the great separation between modern science and metaphysics of philosophy. No longer could the field of science be clubbed with philosophy and even be called natural philosophy. The need for verification, empirical verification, split it off from philosophy and made it the grounds for modern science. So really what we call modern science begins with positivism at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the scientific method. Now, later thinker Durkheim, Auguste Comte is very famous because he is one of the founding fathers of the field of sociology. And we realize the notion of positivism is being applied to the social sciences. Last time we saw how the field of science is divided into the kind of hard sciences and the soft sciences, or natural sciences, which are the sciences of naturally occurring objects or phenomena, physical science, life science, earth science, etc., which is physics, chemistry, biology, etc. And on the other hand, you have the social sciences and the human sciences, psychology, sociology, economics, etc. And Comte is one of the founding fathers of social science. And that's the reason why his use of positivism is so revolutionary, because he was pointing to the fact that you could use this method not only to establish verifiable knowledge in the natural sciences, but even in our study of human beings and their collectives. So another sociologist who followed Auguste Comte is Durkheim, and he fine-tuned the notion of positivism to apply further to sociology and spawned what is known as sociological positivism. And similarly, there's another philosopher called Wittgenstein who took positivism into philosophy and opened up the field of logical positivism. But of course, we are more concerned with sociological positivism. Now, the next major change in this kind of thinking or step in this thinking came in the early 20th century, when positivism was rejected by a number of thinkers on the basis of interpretive sociology. And so again, we see that once Kant has raised this problem of the fact that knowledge is always interpreted, whoever says that we can objectify the world and study it, even if we are talking about subjective knowledge being objectified, this is the basic grounds of human knowledge, still even that can be questioned on the grounds of the fact that everybody's reality is relative because it's interpreted. This interpretive reality also can have common basis. For example, ethnographic sociology, in which we look at what we call thick descriptions, cultures or ethnographic realities. Different cultures, subcultures have their own kinds of assumptions and their own kind of behavioral grammars. that we need to understand if we are to take into account the interpretations that constitute reality or the world to those cultures or subcultures. So interpretive sociologists challenged positivism and opened up what is known as anti-positivism. So early 20th century saw a movement of anti-positivism, and ethnography and participatory kinds of scholarship emerged. Participatory scholarship believes that we cannot actually extricate ourselves from the reality in which we live, and we have to account for our own interpretations and our own involvement changing the reality even as we interact with it or even as we study it as scholars. So how do we account for that? So these kind of considerations, interpretive considerations, spawned the movement of anti-positivism, and that also became a very valid way of understanding knowledge, epistemology in modern times. Three important names in that movement are Georg Simmel, who opened up the field called symbolic interventionism, Max Weber with his theory of ideal types, and we already talked about Edmund Husserl with the philosophy of phenomenology. These are all very important movements that are with us to this day in more complex understandings of how to do research. Now, the next great change or step in modern knowledge acquisition, knowledge theory, comes in the mid to late 20th century in the movement called post-positivism. So we've seen positivism, anti-positivism, and now we find post-positivism. And the great thinker behind post-positivism is the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who said that it isn't really that we build from certitude to certitude, but rather science is a set of tentative conjectures. In other words, we can't be sure of anything at any time, that we make our best guess at any time, and whatever we have as our present state of knowledge will be overcome later. Many of the things that we believe are fixed in stone will be replaced, and we have to understand that that is part of the methodology of science. So instead of achieving certainty through verification, we are setting up a theory and then we are verifying it. We should rather look towards disproving that which is being established as knowledge. Now, it's important for me to step back for a moment and look at positivism again in terms of the two major operations of logic, that is induction and deduction. Now, as we saw in early knowledge production from the time of Aristotle, there was a lot of heed given to deduction. But we find that as we come into the age of science, whether we talk of natural philosophy of Galileo and Newton, or we come to other empiricist notions, the idea of induction becomes more and more important. Induction is important because induction is a form of logic where we arrive at generalities through repetitions, through the fact of repetitions. Now, take very common example. We believe that all crows are black, and we do this because all the crows we've seen are black. If we were to suddenly find that our knowledge is provincial, that only crows in a certain country are black, as soon as we go out into the wide world, we find white crows everywhere else. Immediately, our knowledge of the past will be overcome, and whatever we called a theory will be no longer a theory. So this is a provisional conjecture that we have arrived at through induction, But our induction is not complete. Induction is never complete. Induction is a numerical weight. We arrive at a certain kind of gravity for knowledge because the numbers pile up. But the numbers can be offset by even a single instance which opposes that repeated sameness. So that's where induction is used to create hypothesis. That's one of the bases of hypothesis. There can be other bases of hypothesis, as we'll see when we go deeper into our study. But induction is then the hypothesis that's now formed is then was verified in positivism through searching for various kinds of data and then deducing a theory out of that to validate or invalidate the knowledge. Now, what Popper says is that knowledge at any time is a set of tentative conjectures, and we have to create these conjectures in such a way that they can be disproved. And then we have to try to disprove them. So this is called the falsifiability property of theoretical knowledge or of research methodology. Falsifiability property of research methodology means to do research, you must propose a certain hypothesis that can be disproved. In other words, you cannot make a proposition such as God exists. In other words, if you do make such a proposition, it becomes the onus on you to devise an experiment which can disprove that God exists. If you then find that you cannot disprove that God exists, that means that is untrue until somebody can create an experiment in which they can prove that God exists. So the disprovability has to be built into the statement. In other words, can it be disproved? Can we devise some kind of a experiment through which it can possibly be disproved? Whether we can do it or not is immaterial, but it has to be stated in that manner. So now the next last sort of wrinkle in that entire theory, this actually brings us into the present. These are the ideas behind research methodology and the history that leads us into the scientific method of today. But there is one more little wrinkle, which is not really an advance but an alternative view, which is that of social activism. And a lot of people in research methodology believe that it should be useful. In other words, this leads to what is called activist research. And the activist researchers criticized scientific research of the past, even sociological research, on the basis that it was too purist, that it was armchair thinking, that it meant something only if we could actually use the kind of research that was done to revolutionize the world and make it a better place to live in. The Karl Marx is one of those kinds of people. Though Marxist theory is hardly a scientific theory. It's not based on any kind of verifiability or disprovability property. But nevertheless, we do find that the whole field of what is called critical research or critical theory that arose in the Frankfurt School is based on this kind of activism research. That is, that data needs to be analyzed, including contradictions need to be looked at and analyzed, and that needs to be made the basis or ground for new knowledge. Now that brings us to the end of our understanding of the history of research methodology. I would like to end by talking about what are the basic properties of scientific method. The basic properties of scientific method are simple. They are 4 in number. One is replicability, and we have considered all of them in our journey so far. Replicability means that whatever is being asserted has to be so asserted that it can be repeated by others through experiments and through observations. Knowledge is universal. Knowledge has to be produced in a repeatable manner. The second is precision. The way of statement has to be such that it is not hazy, it is not confused, not confusing, but it is stated in what is called a necessary and sufficient manner. Whatever knowledge is produced using factors that are necessary to its statement and that together are sufficient to its statement. Nothing more is needed, nothing less is needed. There is another property that relates to that, which I'll come to. The third property is falsifiability, and I've already talked about that. That has been introduced by Karl Popper. Falsifiability means that when I'm asserting something in terms of research methodology, it has to be asserted in such a way that I should be able to think of how people can carry out an experiment to falsify it. If it cannot be falsified, then it cannot be a proper subject for inquiry, or the subject of the question for inquiry is not properly stated. The fourth property is what is called parsimony. Parsimony means arriving at the simplest explanation, and this is why I said it has a relationship with necessary and sufficient conditions. Parsimony implies that if a certain phenomenon can be explained in a simple manner, we will not try to explain it in a complex manner. So, what is the simplest way in which something can be explained? Once it has been so explained, if that explanation is not adequate, then we will inevitably find that there are quirks in the understanding that don't completely comprehend the phenomenon being described. And then we'll have to find more complicated answers. But if a simple answer can fully explain a phenomenon, then that answer is adequate to that phenomenon, and that's what research methodology insists on. The objects of research methodology, as we have already understood, are laws and theories. Laws are patterns of behavior that are repeatable, and theories are areas of inquiry that can be explained using one or more laws. So these are the way in which we will proceed, and I hope this gives us an overview of the history and locus of research methodology and what it is that we will proceed to uncover during this course. Thank you.